Right, this is the first election interview, believe it or not, because I'm still waiting to hear from Justin Madders MP as well, and Louise Gittins, who does the Little Neston area for Labour. So it's been now looking at the election from as many sides as we can, which is it's still looking like it's folding down the usual binary side of. After all, despite the Brexit Party being one and the Liberal Democrats being one where you can get full Remain, if they were to have a majority government, it's looking like it's going to simply shape down Labour Conservative lines again, and it looks like, from the point of view of having to set up the campaign for Labour in what is quite short notice, it means that there's very little time, isn't there, to get the messages across to the public that need to be got across from, say, the Labour side. So, for example, if you want to talk about things that are not to do with the Brexit deadlock, for example, the 2017 campaign did seem to gain momentum. Of course, that's the name of Jeremy Corbyn's campaign, but a lot of momentum based on the actual domestic issues with which the Labour government would tackle, such as reversing austerity and putting far more investment into public services. He was able to build a huge popular movement in 2017, Jeremy Corbyn, because he'd just been elected leader fairly recently before that, and despite the fact that we'd had the referendum, that election for some reason didn't seem to be so much about that. Or didn't seem to be fought on those lines. But in 2019, this sudden snap election that's been called has even been dubbed by Sky News as the Brexit election. So if you're a Labour supporter, which you are, do you find it frustrating that you were forced to look at this, the Brexit deadlock, possibly more than the actual issues that Labour would usually campaign on?
I think deadlock. Hi everyone, I'm James Martin. If you recognise my voice, I think the gridlock is best looked at in the real state of the 2017 election in terms of what the Tories had done back then. So you had Theresa May, who again took a gamble, wanting her relatively long by this electoral period and this election, but wanted an election which wasn't really an election, it was really another referendum, and that didn't work out too well for her. Again, following that election result, we ended up with another hung parliament where Theresa May gambled her majority, albeit slim, away to where we are today, where we have a parliament that was, I should say, of course, parliament, the House of Commons is broken up. It's disbanded, but where we had a government that was 298 seats in the end after they restored the whip. An opposition not too far behind, 242 seats, third party, 35, the SNP. It was just becoming impossible for them for anything really to happen in Parliament, certainly relating to Brexit. So an election was always on the cards, but I think it took everyone by some surprise that it was going to be so soon. I personally thought it would have been in February.
So really, it's got. I mean, from the point of view of the establishment now with Boris Johnson, is perhaps he would be able to use this election now to say, look, although I said I'd be able to get Britain out by October the 31st, it's just because of this deadlock in Parliament, and now because we're having an election, if you now get rid of some of my opponents in Parliament, I will be able to get Brexit done. Whereas if the election had been able to be postponed, if the oppositions had managed to somehow hold out on it being actually called until, say, at least February, but maybe even the spring and summer of 2020, there'd be more time for the public, including the more right-wing typical supporting side, the ones that would support the Brexit party in Johnson, to see how he actually handles the whole thing, and maybe longer to see him not be able to handle it very well, for example, which would be more of a boon to the Labour side. But now, by calling it fairly early, he's able to just use that idea that it's just because of the opposition that he's unable to deliver Brexit to get it done.
Well, I think that's certainly been his argument in blaming the opposition. But yet again, what we've got to consider is two things. Again, we've got the Conservative Party using the British public as the arbiter for its own internal problems. This election hasn't been called because of the opposition scuppering the Tories' Brexit ideas at all. This election's been called because the far right in the Conservative Party and the far right in the country at large are now directly influencing the Conservative Party. I have absolutely no love whatsoever. Forgive me if I show a few biases, but I certainly subscribe to the Bevin lower than vermin ideology when it comes to the Tories and what they've done and their absolute acts of cruelty. But let's just consider that even I didn't expect the like of Kenneth Clarke, the likes of Churchill's grandson to be booted out. This is again, this election's been called to resolve issues within the Conservative Party, under the guise of giving people another chance. And I think that the only thing that the opposition's guilty of is the Tory supporting owned YouGov pollsters that are out there in giving the public the belief that the Labour Party is somehow 20 points behind, and there's no real opposition to the increasingly popular Johnson. The reality is a bit different in the country.
So now we've found that, as you say, the Conservative Party, the Tories, have become incredibly divided, because it was a place where, when they called the referendum, David Cameron, he was on the Remain side. He was hoping that would win. Theresa May was on the Remain side, but had to conduct a prime ministership, or whatever you call that, premiership or something. I think
I have a few words.
Yes,
I don't think I can say them though.
No, I'm sure you will. Well, I suppose depends how partisan this station's meant to be, because it's an online stream, but it's also occasionally put it out on small FM. But Theresa May had to root for the Brexit side, didn't she? Even though she was backing Remain beforehand. But now we see under Johnson, as soon as he was elected leader, that's it. It's a Brexit supporting prime minister. Even though actually you could point out that at one point he was actually undecided. Before all of this, he was actually undecided as to which side to follow. It was an interesting historical. Well, hopefully it is a fact, otherwise it'd be a bit useless to give this anecdote, wouldn't it?
Well, actually, to come in at this point, Johnson was supporting remaining in the EU. Some of his comments before a referendum were called were in favour of at least remaining in a customs union with the EU. Now, I'll give him, as everyone else, should be entitled to the right to change their mind. But Johnson, famously writing two letters to the same paper, one in support of Remain, one in support of Leave, gives you a bit of an idea as to the way that Boris Johnson thinks. And that is, he thinks about himself first, and anything else is another consideration. Boris Johnson wanted to become Prime Minister. That's been his goal. As for which side of the argument would further that particular agenda, that's the reason why he's a Leave supporter now, because, well, as I say, the far right wing who supported his campaign to be Prime Minister have given him what he wants.
Mm. So that's why we see it divided. And now we actually see the Conservative Party, the Tory Party, completely divided then, don't we? We see that actually people now on the Remain side, that they're sometimes called the Tory moderate. I wonder if that's I mean, I suppose, could there be moderate leavers, like, the Lexit side, Labour leavers? But we see people, as you said, like Ken Clarke and Churchill's grandson, and even, we see them getting more or less thrown out, don't we? And now it's actually a parallel with Donald Trump and his relationship with the Republican Party, because comments have been made there that it's become more or less the Trump Party under him. He is. It's been a divide, and those that support him are the ones that are left, and it's what we're kind of seeing now with Boris Johnson, where it's absolutely split down that side. So that makes the election sort of interesting, because if you actually are a Tory voter that doesn't actually support leaving, maybe you're more moderate. Where do you go in this election now? Because you have the Brexit Party is very obvious what it's for. They've said they will stand down in all the seats that are Tory strongholds, but Nigel Farage tried to get Boris Johnson to do the same and stand down for him in the reverse, whatever that is, but they've refused to do so. So I think, where Brexit Party, for example, is like in this constituency, which is Ellesmere Port and Neston, where it's typically a Labour stronghold. I mean, this election might even change that. You never know. I mean, the Conservatives will be standing against Brexit Party candidates still, and so really, if you're a hardcore leaver, the choice is maybe fairly simple, I suppose, in this election. If you actually are not even bothered, you just say, oh, I don't care if it's a no deal, we just want it out no matter what, we want to sever everything. You could just go Brexit Party. You could probably vote Conservative for that as well, obviously, and then the remaining choice should be Liberal Democrat, because obviously they have said, well, no matter what, we'll try to revoke Article 50. They need a big majority for that, which has never happened in the history of the party, has it? And then with Labour, it's very difficult to get the message across there, because they're offering a compromise, actually, between more or less, which is a softer form of Brexit, or, as Corbyn will offer it in the referendum, just to remain if that referendum then says to remain. In fact, I could have put that more simply, which just goes to show the problem they'll have in getting that message across as to what their stance is. So they've got to talk about all of this before they can talk, say with Labour, about, well, you know what, we're going to actually put so much more into the public services that have been withdrawn. Well, they could make the point, for example, about the police officers, that they seem to, the Conservative Party under Johnson, saying, well, you know what, we'll put 20,000 police officers extra back. Well, they didn't use the word back, actually, so we are being politically biased, because Labour Party would say they were taken away, so you're just actually restoring what was there, but actually it's there's 1,000 different between the 21,000 that was cut. So,
well, I think there's two things you've sort of mentioned, which really come under the umbrella of the extent in which the media and the Tories have really this election's about language as much as it is about anything else. I mean, the idea that we would call anyone a Tory moderate when you've been sanctioned is laughable. But when we frame, or as it has been, this election has been framed as a Brexit election, these people seem reasonable. At the end of the day, these people, including the Liberal Democrats, have voted consistently for cuts. The number of disabled people, I believe the figure's about 140,000, have committed suicide since 2010 as a result of the unbelievably cruel, even by the UN standards, method. So I would never refer to the Tories as moderate. And secondly, I suppose if this election is just about Brexit, then we might as well not have a general election. We might as well just have another referendum. The parties, I mean, this is in a way 2017 on steroids. The Tories wanted this to be about Brexit. The Liberal Democrats wanted this to be about Brexit. Meanwhile, in the real world, Brexit now, yes, it dominates people's discussions. If you're, door knocking or anything like that, of course, it's an issue. But I remember back in 2015, the EU wasn't mentioned at all. It was immigration, hospitals, the economy, welfare. It was the other stuff, and I just think that the Tories and the Liberals, by locking horns on the issue of Brexit, ignore what the rest of the countries having to put up with when there's hospitals are at breaking point, when roads, the number of potholes, the state of our roads. Certainly in England, you drive up. I'm just on the border with Scotland. I drive over into Scotland, and the motorways are clean. They're patched up. In England, you have never-ending cones. There are more issues with an election than just Brexit, and certainly more than the BBC's stuff on broadband communism, which I just think is another example of the flat-out media attack on the Labour Party specifically that we're seeing. I think you've touched on a point there, which is Labour does have a difficulty with, or the leadership has difficulty with Brexit. I wouldn't suggest that the membership do. I would suggest that most members of the Labour Party would be happy with a Remain or a sensible deal. There is an issue with the Brexit message, yes. But I suppose the more the Labour Party focus on Brexit, the more they have to clarify. And actually, when you look at the rest of their manifesto, not that I've seen it, of course, before its release, but it's certainly very exciting.
Well, it's Thursday, actually, I think he said, yes, but it should be. Obviously, We've heard a lot of things they're saying anyway, giving away tidbits of the massive amount of things that are going to be putting back into the public sectors, bringing lots of companies, such as parts of BT even, back into public ownership, but also Royal Mail and also restoring many things that have been cut during the austerity. Actually, the confusing message, slightly confusing message that it's perceived that Labour has on Brexit, even though it could be looked at very simply. Actually, either it's going to be a softer deal that will avoid the dangers of no deal, or just simply remaining and putting the choice between those two to a referendum. It's quite simple when you look at it. But
if I can simplify it further, if you voted to remain, you voted for one thing. I would suggest, actually, just as an aside to that, if the referendum had an option of remain and reform or leave, I think Remain would have won by at least 5 points. I don't think anyone just wants to remain for more of the same. The EU does need reform, whether we're in it or not. But if you voted to leave, I mean, if I just give you a list of some of the points people have made to me about voting to leave, I've had one person who said to me that by voting leave, they thought in actual fact they'd remain. Many people said they voted leave because they hated the then Cameron government and Cameron specifically. Some people said, well, they thought that it would mean that we would have a trading relationship, but we wouldn't be subject to rules. I haven't met anyone who has been able to say exactly the same as another in terms of what leave meant. But it tends to be, when I speak to people who voted to remain, they tend to have a message. Now, the reason I mentioned that, let's just put it into context. The Labour Party wants another referendum that has a so-called sensible leave option. My view would probably be some sort of customs arrangement, maybe a sort of Norway style, or it'll be remain and reform. That's it.
what I do find is you can speak to some people who said they were Labour voters. I'm afraid, I mean, there's lots of anecdotes coming in about this, and I can say that I've met quite a few people. A lot of them, though, they don't seem to be natural Jeremy Corbyn supporters, unfortunately. They may well have voted during Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's era for Labour. Maybe they're almost in the position of someone like Alan Sugar, and they seem to. And some of these people, amongst them that I spoke to, are staunch Remainers. It says that they now cannot back the Labour Party, and then there are some. So this seems to be a bit of a problem in terms of convincing people, particularly the more fanatical some people are about Remain, rather than being a Remain moderate, maybe. But if having to sort of make a patchwork of words up for this whole mess of a situation, it seems to be a problem in trying to convince them that Labour would be a good idea to vote for that reason. In other words, you're going to get a choice. And Remain could even win in that. Whereas the Liberal Democrats, they would have to get a majority government to even get it through Parliament, wouldn't they, to revoke Article 50? So, actually, it's not an easy choice. It's not an easy choice for anybody who just wants Remain no matter what, and is not even thinking that much about the other things, about the other issues of the country. Of course, in the meantime, while everything has been about Brexit, and Parliament has been so dominated by it, domestic issues have probably taken quite a back seat, haven't they?
Well, when you look at, and of course I'm not going to suggest that Brexit isn't an issue or anything like that, but when you look at the cost of living, when you actually look at the way that our society is compared to just where it was 5 years ago. Having a Donald Trump-esque extreme, an extremist, very polarized country is not the country that I think most people want. I mean, it's one of these things. There is an opportunity with this election to actually have some realistic hope. In fact, you sort of see it. It's been pleasant in the past 2 weeks to focus on, royal scandals, Tory scandals, Jacob Rees-Mogg, rather than Brexit. In fact, it's been pleasant not to listen to Brexit related stories, for the first time really since June 2017. We haven't, and I think on your point about extremists within parties and sort of former Labour Party grandees, they couldn't support. Yeah, I agree. There's been a lot of people leave the parliamentary Labour Party who probably shouldn't have been there in the first place.
Because it was so broad, because it was it was probably not just in the centre territory, but it might have been in the centre-right territory, and therefore it had a huge, broad amount of people who would be called the Blairites, or they even had a movement that was opposite to Momentum called Progress, didn't they?
But yes, but I mean, again, let's just put things into a bit of reality. I mean, to a Norwegian friend of mine, Jeremy Corbyn's their equivalent of a liberal Tory. At the end of the day, Corbyn wants to bring us to the same standards and rights and levels of nationalisation that the country had in 1994.
Not even the 70s, just 94. I mean,
well, yes, he's not proposed nationalising British Airways, has he? As used to be the case under BOAC. He's not proposed nationalising the motor industry, as we had with British Leyland. He's not proposed, I can carry on. He's proposing nationalising the utilities. And in 94, we still had British Rail, just. We still had some elements of the water board. We still had a degree of control. We certainly had control over the Royal Mail We most certainly had, albeit the cleaners and some contracts in the NHS, but a National Health Service without Richard Branson's grubby hands all over it.
Oh, yes.
It's hardly a radical approach, is it, when you just consider, within most people's lifetimes, that's the level of nationalisation Corbyn wants to come back to. But, don't look in the past. Broadband, it only arrives through this. It runs through the same cables into your house.
Yes, well, I pay quite a lot for the one on this connection. It's a good connection, costs quite a lot, so it'd be interesting to see what would happen if we really did get some nationalisation there, and we just had, to see what sort of service we would get. But this is an interesting
in Carlisle. The Liberal and the Labour Party in during the First World War and then in the Second, and just after, the pubs were nationalised in Carlisle, all of them, which is one of my favourite facts. Incorporate socialism and alcohol, so I'm always up for that.
Oh, yes. Well, I think this is an interesting one we've got to, and I think it would be good to include, actually, even though I wasn't originally going to do this or hadn't thought of it, is the media perception of Corbyn, because you make an interesting point that actually it's that's how unradical it is. It's seen as quite a normal thing by countries such as Norway, but of course we've got the mainstream media that seems to be altering perceptions of him hugely by the public by making him seem like, oh, this is going to be it's going to be like communist sort of Cuba. It's going to be like Russia. And then taking us back to the 70s, which of course there was a lot more things in public ownership, and you could go to university with a grant. So maybe that's not a good idea to point out. Back to the 70s hasn't got the negative connotations.
Well, why not? Let's again be real here. When we look at the 70s, yes, the figure that's quoted is the 3-day week. Most countries are moving to that. Just very briefly, the UK economy grew by 8.6% when the 3-day week was on the highest it's ever grown. And the reason for it is because you're not economically productive while you're in work. Mm-hmm. You're only productive for an economy, really, when you're out spending.
With the money that has been got from the rat race, or even, obviously, income from benefits does go back into the economy. So it's not actually, the right wing would present it as a dead loss, but it isn't, because you have to go out and get milk and tea bags and services and things, don't you?
And you're taxed on them. And as for Russia, you mentioned, going back to Russia, guys, it's amazing. We've gone from Reds under the bed to here's what Putin said. We've got, Russia has farms where, and you don't need to take my word on this, look it up. Russia has farms for creating fake profiles on social media, Twitter, and proxies via the likes of Aaron Banks and some of the others, has been financing some of the extreme right across the world for its advantage. While we're looking at things short term, looking at immigration, it's usually a short term issue. Second generation immigrants are nationality and by and large culturally assimilated as first generation can be. We're thinking about leave, remain. We're not thinking about how we're going to power the country. Most of the power stations projects that were started in terms of proposals back in 2008 have been scrapped. Hinkley-C being an exception. We're not thinking about what do we want a manufacturing base? We're thinking very short term, and that's only to one country's advantage. And that's Russia. I'm under no illusion that one of the best chess players, and some might disagree, I can just hear we couldn't possibly be influenced by Russia. It's all a conspiracy and everything. Well, I'll just say this. Russia has not only annexed the Crimea, but is also making moves to re-enter the geopolitical stage. It can only do so. It's hemmed in by the EU and mutual defense treaties. You've got to bear in mind Putin signed and gave a vow to protect the territorial integrity of the Soviet Union. And that's what he's doing. I know we're now in Russia and all of that, but he wants his borders back. And the best way to do that is disrupt Europe and, crucially, disrupt the other people who sit on the UN Security Council. When the US is infighting, and if Britain begins to collapse, who exactly occupies those seats? Who's keeping people in check? So within that context, have a look at the media and the ownership of the media in this country. You'll find ties back to Russia, and if you don't, you'll find a very hard right wing who are terrified of a Corbyn government.
So this also might be the reason why it was alleged that the Russians, well, they might have interfered in the elections to bring about Donald Trump's presidency. I guess it would be that would run along the same lines.
Yes. And I can see in France, for example, in the next 2 years, a rise of separatists in France. Maybe 2 years is a bit short, but in the next couple of years at least.
Frexit. So we can so change the status quo and give us a load of buzzwords instead of maybe the stability of what went before. If you're a Labour campaigner and you're on the doorstep now in these couple of weeks before the election, and you also keep coming across people who sincerely believe that Jeremy Corbyn is a terrorist based on the mainstream media agenda to paint him as such, or just from the side, from the Conservative side. We can't really be that impartial there. What in a quick strategy would you do to try and dispel that?
The truth will liberate you, but first it will piss you off. So if you're knocking on someone's door and they say Jeremy Corbyn's a terrorist, ask them why. Why do they think that? Where did they get that information from? You can go down the route of, saying, well, look at Thatcher and Pinochet, look at Johnson, and, we could go down those routes at the end of the day. I mean, politics is already in the gutter. But they think that he's a terrorist. Well, okay, you're not voting for Jeremy Corbyn, you're voting for your MP at the end of the day. And one of the quickest methods I've found is, right, here's 10 Labour Party policies. Which one do you not like? Right. And phrasing it like this is a much better way of being able to then engage people on, well, what do you mean by he's a terrorist? What do you mean that he's been over here? And especially people in work, I frequently say to trade union members who aren't a big fan of Corbyn, if that person was a member in a workplace, you would probably be representing him in a grievance or her in a grievance, because what we've seen is bullying. I would also question why on earth do they think that every single avenue, from the BBC through the print press, are so against him? What has he done?
So they're obviously worried about the mainstream, the rich owners of the mainstream media and the backers of the likes of the Daily Mail and the Sun are obviously worried that he actually will be able to do some of the things that he says he will be able to do. Again, it won't be able to be sort of impartial, but there's been that Thatcher has had to talk to the IRA. The Tony Blair.
Is he a terrorist? Because he certainly met IRA members a hell of a lot more than Corbyn did. And let us not forget as well that one of the key players wasn't Blair when it came to the Irish peace process. It was Mo Mowlam, and her name needs to be remembered. And it was her determination, and also from other sides as well. But from the Labour Party side, it was Mo Mowlam, and she was the one who asked for Corbyn's assistance. For it then to be used against him all those years later is frankly perverse.
So to create this Good Friday Agreement that was so historic, do you think that? I mean, we could get onto that straight after this, couldn't we? But anyway, before we do, one thing that seems logical is that if you're empowering government, you will have to end up talking to terrorist organisations if you need to broker a peace process, because you can't do it with no dialogue whatsoever. You just, and things were achieved. So actually, that hasn't been discredited. We did end up with the Good Friday Agreement, and even secretly, the Thatcher administration, for example, did have to negotiate to some extent, despite saying we don't negotiate. It's just something that couldn't be avoided anyway. And Jeremy Corbyn has won a peace award, and has listened to all the people's point of view, but gets slurred with, he has said he is a friend of Hamas and that he's a terrorist sympathiser with the IRA just through the same sort of associations that everybody has to make just to broker a peace process. He's just forward thinking, and we can't present this impartially because the argument against Corbyn is not either. So,
well, I completely agree, and I think anyone who genuinely believes that he's a terrorist, or for that matter, any other politician is a terrorist, really does need to have a good think on what it is that they're saying and where they're getting their information from. That notion is utterly ridiculous.
But of course, we're looking now. How do you actually get people's mindsets to change on something like that? Because even if I was a Labour supporter, I might not say. I wouldn't say Margaret Thatcher is a terrorist sympathiser. It's quite extreme language to use. I would understand the point of negotiating with the IRA to some extent to try and bring about a peaceful solution.
Another argument here is, and Nigel Farage, Aaron Banks, the Brexit lot that you're not. Well, people aren't discussing. Are they not terrorists? Receiving money to destabilise the UK.
So it depends. I mean, it depends how exactly you frame the idea. But yes, any form of establishment destabilisation. I mean, I suppose short of the phone box being blown to bits, I suppose.
where was the outrage? I suppose as well when Donald Trump openly and on a radio station interfered in our electoral process.
So there's all these things, but ultimately that's what you fight. You're fighting a very determined. If you're now gunning for Labour for this election, in the short period of time, you really are fighting a determined effort to run the biggest smear campaign in history, which is what I think another angry voice said, and the Canary against the prospective new Prime Minister, Jeremy Corbyn. So
as a voter. In this election, the choice that faces the country is a choice about the future direction that this country takes. It either heals itself or it bitterly divides, and by that I mean it breaks apart quickly.
And that also means, Scottish independence, because I presume that a Johnson victory, which could be the most likely, maybe even just a small majority. It's still kind of hard to call, but at the same time, it feels like that. It feels a bit like 2017, where Theresa May felt that she would get a majority. It feels like that again. Who knows? We could be surprised again, but there's less time for, say, the Labour side to to build the popular momentum again. You know, even when we're talking about appearing at Glastonbury and bringing celebrities on stage, such as Steve Coogan, in the cold, hard November rain, it's more difficult. So, yes, when it's cold, it's harder to get it organised. So I'm just thinking that literally the weather forecast might have inspired them to call this election. Actually, it's going to be. It already is a colder autumn than last year.
I was expecting a February election, but I think two other considerations. One, the weather. Well, actually, the time of year. I mean, if you're in Nahallen and Yar, up in the Western Isles, you're dealing with about 2 hours sunlight. So it remained probably a few more hours, but. You know, the debate is, does sunlight affect the Liberals or the SNP vote? I don't know. But it's, you know, the second Thursday in December is the most popular Christmas night out. Students aren't necessarily going to be where they would be if it was in June, for example, or other times in the year. And also there was a mail strike. I think these considerations have all been taken into account by the government, and I think they consider that they can do a little bit better. I mean, I have a range of predictions as to where it is that I think will end up. Some of which isn't very pleasant, some of which is maybe a little bit better. But I think, you know, at the moment, as things stand, I think we're heading into not much difference from 2017.
As in, it could end up hung, or I mean, I think the most likely options, I mean, I'm just going to have to play election punditry now, aren't I, would be that they'll end up with a smallish majority, a bit like Cameron's 15 again, or it will end up sort of hung with Labour as the largest party, and it will therefore not really be different from where we ended up in 17, or it could even be a fairly substantial majority. But I suppose also you have to look at whether the Brexit Party really will split the vote still, because the Conservatives haven't stood down in the Labour strongholds, and but the Brexit Party candidates have stood down in the Conservative ones. So that means also the deposits that the Brexit Party candidates paid to Nigel Farage, because it's his party, isn't it? It's his party, and he'll cry if he wants you.
Again, let's look at the language.
Yes.
Nigel Farage doesn't have a party; he has a limited company.
Yeah, so that's a bit confusing. I mean, he could explain that. I mean, obviously, when you vote, you'll see it as a political party. You'll see, Conservative, Brexit, Labour, Justin Madders in this area, Liberal, Democrat. How is it not a party then?
Well, the Labour Party is a registered political party, and the Brexit Party is a registered company that is donating to candidates. Remember, they have to pay, I think it's £100 to be a candidate for the Brexit Party, yes. Something like this. I mean, I should imagine that there'll be some court cases going on. If there are, at the moment, obviously, don't wish to prejudice them, but I'm not aware of them, is what I'm saying. But yes, it's... again, if you were to type in and Google the Brexit Party Limited, you can find quite a bit of information on Companies House. Whereas as a registered political party, there are other. It's really to do with donations, taxation, and transparency. And my suspicion is that before the Brexit Party submit their account, which they would have to do next year, I would suggest it'll go insolvent, so they'll never have to release that information.
Particularly after this election, where it should be resolved with fingers up in the air. Anyway, these are 100 candidates that have been told by Nigel Farage to stand down. A lot of them aren't happy. Some of them are even going to run as independents, so it won't even achieve the effect of not splitting the vote, but they've been told to stand down in the Conservative stronghold. So basically, you could look at that now as if you vote for the Brexit Party, you're voting for the Tories. It's the same thing because that's their policy, isn't it?
I don't know what the policy is. The Brexit Party. I mean, if people are and they will, and I reckon they'll come out with about 5% of the vote. If you're voting Brexit Party and you're listening to this, my question is, what's the Brexit Party's stance on road repairs or education, for that matter? What does the Brexit Party believe in when it comes to foreign trade? Do they believe in protection, principles of prevention? What's the Brexit Party's view on your redundancy rights or trade union rights?
But we can cut through all this, can't we? Because there's no manifesto to read. In fact, I remember when it was UKIP in 2015 and 2010, even they hastily assembled a manifesto, which in some ways was interesting because, for example, for disability rights, it was slightly better. Maybe they could have said anything. It was kind of paradoxical. On others, it sounded far right in tone, So, but basically, at the moment, just like UKIP sounded like they quickly opened a laptop in a pub late on a Monday night or something and quickly wrote something, saved it, and put it on the website. The Brexit Party at this stage don't have a manifesto because it's a one-issue party, and yet, if they were actually to get a majority government, which I guess is very unlikely, especially with the sort of allegiance with the Conservative Party, where they're standing down, so that you're voting for virtually the same thing. They don't have a manifesto, so you can't know anything other than getting out of Europe, no deal, more or less.
All I know is that Donald Trump supports them, which for me is a strong enough reason not to.
So you could look at his record, I suppose. But if you like what Donald Trump does and in the US and what sort of tone he is, then the Brexit Party is probably for you as well.
Probably is for you. Yes, I agree.
So, we're talking about this, and the last thing I want to do is kind of the Good Friday Agreement, but the Liberal Democrats fascinate me for this reason. That obviously we have the record to look back on, which, from the point of view of, say, a Labour voter from 2010 to 15, it looks fairly appalling because obviously they were sharing power with the Conservatives. 20% split, wasn't it? 2080, that was the official deal. We had the very, very publicised thing where the uni fees went up 3 times, and Nick Clegg first said that he was opposed to it, and we have a few examples actually of where they might have actually limited some of the Conservative austerity, such as, for example, they wanted to remove all housing benefits for people under 25, and that the Liberal Democrats actually managed to stop that, supposedly. So what we want to look at, if you're a Liberal Democrat supporter, another one is Joe Swinton often voting in favour of things that the Conservatives were voting for, such as introducing bedroom tax. I mean, that's a bit more clear cut. But if you look back at the relationship that Nick Clegg and the Liberal Democrats at the time had with the coalition, how much of it do you think would have been under the control of the Liberal Democrats? For example, was Nick Clegg actually able to stop those tuition fee rises or not? Because if you look back at them and say they are almost like the Tories, some people are saying, but are they, or was it because their hands were tied? It seems confusing to know where they really stood during 10 to 15.
Very simply, very simple answer to this. I really enjoy it when Liberal Democrats explain, especially from a trade union perspective, where we're used to negotiating. There's 2 ways of looking at it. I think both very straightforward. One, they were appalling negotiators and were the Conservatives. And 2, this absolute arrogance that they had to form a coalition. No, they didn't. They didn't have to form a coalition with the Labour Party either, or the Rainbow Coalition, as it could have been. Oh,
yes. Well, it would have had to involve an awful lot more parties to make that at the time, I do remember. So they would have had to have brought in Plaid Cymru, SNP and many others from memory. Yeah. So, in other words, the Conservative deal was far easier. It was just them, just like with the DUP that we've just had now, one other party.
The Liberal Democrats could have formed a supply and confidence arrangement with the Conservative Party, voting on an issue-by-issue basis. Therefore, they wouldn't have had to have compromised on tuition fees. They could have been held to public scrutiny during the coalition. People could have seen the way that they were voting and their opposition. And instead, they entered into a coalition. They saddled us with one of the most anti-democratic acts going in the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, designed to keep themselves in their ministerial cars. Forgive the bias, but that's true. They could have actually done what opposition parties do, which is hold the government of the day to account. I actually think the Tories wouldn't have been able to get away with any of what they were wanting if the Liberals had joined the opposition benches and scrutinised every bill that the Tories put forward. That would have most likely led to an early election. But if you just think about how that would have changed things, for one, an AV referendum, would that have occurred? Would the Scottish independence have occurred? Would this entire debacle of Brexit, trying to sort out the Tories' 300-year indecision in Europe, have occurred? Probably not. And that is as second to the cuts that they voted for to the NHS, to the disabled, to those who are on welfare entitlements. I'm sorry if I've just gone on a little bit longer than I would like to have done there, but for me it's very simple. The notion that there was inevitability that the Liberals had to join government for the sake of some sort of stability is utterly ludicrous. You compare this now, and if you have a look at Jo Swinson's strategy, she is wanting another coalition. There is no other way of arguing it.
Despite saying, obviously, she wants to be Prime Minister. Well, maybe she would. Maybe she would be Deputy Prime Minister if that was able to happen. But she will do absolutely no negotiation with the Labour Party. I mean, surely that's the only coalition they could get now.
I don't know. I mean, I'm just having a look at there's sort of three. There's about 20% of me thinks that the Labour Party and the SNP could actually form a 1945 Attlee style government. I think the reality is going to be that yes, the Tories gain a majority, albeit slender. It's about 50%. The rest of it seems to be in the hung parliament territory, with Labour perversely gaining seats. In fact, coming back to where they started in 2017, and the Tories losing out to the Liberals. Now, if that was the case, and let's give some numbers here, the Tories got 245 seats. I should say this particular model has been produced by Sean Duggan of Neath in Wales, who's a Labour Party member and statistician, of which I've had some contribution to the way it works out, but he's done a very good piece of work on this, where he says that the Tories get 245 seats, Labour 259, and the Liberals get 63. Now, I'm about 20-30% confident in these stats, but there we are. They're just guesses at the end of the day. If that was the case, well, the Tories could find a problem in getting a majority without the Liberal Democrats and the DUP. Labour would find it difficult in getting a majority without the SNP implied, in which there would almost certainly be a request for another independence referendum. Really, if we're heading back into hung parliament territory again, the mess of Brexit isn't going to be resolved. Just another thing on this. The media seems to have a very, very poor understanding of how these Brexit negotiations work. If you think that, January the 31st or whenever it is that we apparently will leave the EU again, either with or without a deal, well, if we leave with a deal, Brexit's not over. We're only at stage 1. Stage 2 then comes the interesting bit, which is around the economics and politics of how we actually transition to the deal as arranged. And if you think it's been interesting so far, you wait until that happens.
Particularly won't be leaving the news, basically, because there's so much to negotiate.
Yeah.
What obviously, though, this could be heading to a no deal, though, couldn't it? If they did get enough of a majority, they'll be able to get it through Parliament. Is that just simply Boris Johnson's aim? Is actually not to have a deal at all?
Well, it could very well be. I have some worries about workers' rights, which I know we'll talk about in a few minutes. But you've got to bear in mind he would have to go again. He'd have to repeal various bits of legislation that have passed, preventing a no deal. If he got a majority, he could do that, of course, provided he has the numbers on his benches. Not all of the Tory Remainers have been deselected. Albeit most of them have. It could very well be. I think Johnson is now of the opinion that a trading relationship with the US is what he wants. Essentially, a hire and fire. People working 3 jobs, no rights, employment law abolished in favour of taking your employee to court system like you have in the US, chlorinated chicken, etc. I think that is actually what he wants.
Why would he want these sorts of things? You think? I know, because this won't sound impartial, will it? This sounds like a George Orwell novel. So,
well, yeah, there's more money in that.
So it comes down to simply that, because obviously.
Well, yes. I mean, Brexit has made a number of millionaires and the Tory benches just on currency speculation alone. The notion that you can go from trading with Europe to all of a sudden trading with the US is fiction. Supply chains take about 10 years really to form and develop. For example, if you're buying fridge units from Germany, chances are you know where the cheapest provider is. You know that there are how the freight operates, be it by sea, by port, or by rail, and what have you. You figured out which is better for your company, by and large, and you figured out how you understand what the domestic market is. Well, okay. Tariffs become so punitive that you have to look to somewhere else. Let's say there's an arrangement with the US. Well, how do you know? I mean, for one, is there a merchant fleet capable of traveling the Atlantic? 2, it's going to be more costly because of the fuel distances. 3, do you know where your cheapest supplier is? 4, does that supplier and does that fridge unit meet UK standards? These things just don't happen overnight, which is what appears to be being suggested. Let me put it in a different way with the US, and this is really where I think the crux of the matter is. If you look at the top 10, I mean, Britain is not a exporter. Thatcher decimated our industry, and when Brown tried to start a green industry, solar panels, grants and all of that, and the Tories scrapped them, we really don't make too much anymore. But in terms of our top singular export market, mainly whiskey and other things, is the US. So we export around about 12.7% of our exports there. After that, and in this order, just as I'm going to give a country and percentage, Germany 10.5, the Netherlands 7.6, France 6.5, Ireland 6.2, China 5.3, Belgium and Luxembourg 4.2, Switzerland 3.5, Spain 3.2, Italy 3.
So the European ones add up to a lot more than the US taken together.
Yeah, of course they do. Of course they add up a lot more, but also, well, out of our top 10 export markets, only 2 of them are outside of the continent of Europe. Now, if you then compare this to our imports, now our top importer, 14.6% of all imports, a value of 61 billion, is from Germany. After that, you've got China at 8.937 billion, then the Netherlands 8%, then the US 6.8, then France, then Belgium and Luxembourg, Norway, Italy, Spain and Ireland. Again, most of our imports come from the continent of Europe.
That's our EU members, of course. Obviously, Norway isn't a proper member, or isn't a member. Switzerland isn't, but obviously the rest. It's it's big things like Germany and France there, isn't it? That we're doing a lot of deals with.
My point's not just about the EU; it's just the practicalities. Yep. It's cheaper that they live nearer.
They're nearer. They're literally nearer. They don't have to have not as long on a plane or a train or a lorry that comes through the Channel Tunnel, etc., etc.
This is the problems of economic geography, and what the US wants is I can see this is the US wants to replace China as our number 2. And preferably replace Germany as our number 1 importer. But you've got to just then look at who pays. Trump, we keep on hearing from the Tories about the World Trade Organization and how great that is. And in fact, one minister said, oh, well, we'll go back to the World Trade rules that we had 40 years ago. Well, the World Trade Organization only was established in Marrakesh in 1995. So, actually, our membership of the EU predates the WTO. Plus, Trump wants to remove the US from it, finding it, a bit too problematic for his own tariff wars. You've got essentially a free trade agreement with the US that Trump wants us to be able to, to be able to cancel within a 6-month period. So where's the stability there? Well, it doesn't matter because, I'll just say this, if we end up having to pay extortionate tariffs, the government doesn't care. If you think genuinely they do, look again. Look at Yellowhammer, look at their preparations. All designed to keep themselves safe, really. Why on earth would a government put at risk the medicine and food supplies of a country? Well, I can think of some countries in history that would, but not, by the way, Britain. You essentially have to look at these tariffs. If we end up having to pay, Tesco isn't going to absorb 15% tariffs on foodstuffs. It's going to be passed on to us.
Everyone helps add to the price, yes.
So how do we begin to square that circle? And again, let's just come back to the real issue here. We've had this mess with Brexit, irrespective of how anyone voted. The notion of having 3 months extension, then another 3 months, and then lies and lies. No one has been honest in when 2 years was never long enough for a complicated divorce, if you will, after 47 years, 46 years, whatever it was, to come to some financial arrangements, economic arrangements, what happens with people who've travelled, live, all of this. 2 years is not long enough. In fact, the reason why Article 50 it suggests 2 years was actually to scare countries, I think, from leaving. So reality had to hit, but because the far right wanted us just to leave, because it benefited, Trump and Putin, we've ended up nibbling at the edges, 3 months here, 3 months there. The reality is we could probably have done with 5 years, and that really could have been explained to the public. And then after that, yes, it's going to be another 5 years, but you know what? We're heading in one direction, so there we go. We have to do something. At the end of the day, I always say people get countries get the governments they deserve. But if you had sensible government, they would say, right, well, we'll carry out your instruction, but we will do so in a way that won't threaten medical supplies and food supplies, nor in fact would need for us to print off rationing cards, which the government has done.
Oh yes, so it's like, oh, that's nice and nostalgic for the World War II and the community spirit of the Blitz we could bring back with the yellow hammer. One example is diabetes, actually, isn't it? That situation's a bit alarming, is it? Because we don't manufacture insulin within the UK.
Well, you've hit raw nerve there, because of course, well, I'm type 1 diabetic. I'm insulin dependent. So the notion of, there is actually a farm in Stafford that produces a few vials a year as a result of some farming process. But no, all of our imports come from Sweden.
So what would they actually do? Say it was a no-deal scenario and things are getting held up at customs. Do you think they would put any emergency measures in?
Well, there's the question. The economies of the world have benefited from the quicker transport route. So we have, just in time, next day trade of goods, services, medicines, all of that. And, well, insulin needs to be refrigerated. It's no good just sat there in a container. It needs to be refrigerated, which I'm sure it is. It is transported by refrigeration, but delays can cause shortages. Which, when there's shortages, that means that there's more delays. It's a pretty nasty cycle when you've got to consider, insulin's not sort of flew in. It doesn't have a seat on a plane kind of thing. It's brought into our ports via, I think, Immingham, Dover, that kind of stuff. And yeah, you're not just talking about insulin, you're talking about a whole host of other things.
Yes, that are manufactured over there, and people are depending on it. When we talk about insulin, actually, this is an interesting one that one of the most famous cases of victims of sanctioning for benefits was the case of David Clapson, who was on, presumably it was job seekers allowance at the time, or just before universal credit came in, and he was sanctioned, and you require to keep your insulin in the fridge, and when his pay-as-you-go electricity ran out, that went off, and he died. So you're talking about, because it's again, this has how anyone can hear stories like that without becoming very angry indeed. This is, to your listeners, this is what this government and previously the Liberals supported and enabled. The idea that people did he die, or was he a victim of state-sponsored murder, I suppose? We could have that argument, but that should never have happened in this country. No, but this is the consequence of taking away almost all of someone's income. On the technical thing you could say is that if you're sanctioned, you can apply for hardship payments which would reduce it from, say, £73 a week to 40, or there'd be a delay in getting that. So when we look at it, we're talking about you could be at zero and you things like pay-as-you-go electricity and gas, because if you're not on pay-as-you-go, the supply won't go off straight away. But if you are in a low-income situation, obviously it's private companies that run our utilities now. There's no compassion there that we need the electricity and gas to stay on. It goes off. So, and if it's vital to someone's life, depending on it for their medical supplies, that still goes off. This is where we could look at, the effects of these things have on the poorest and most vulnerable people in our society.
Well, or the NHF, that's National Hairdressers Federation. That's different. The NHS is people who say, "Oh, it's on life support." No, actually, it's a few jolts away from complete death. In the United States, where you'd be looking at spending something in the region of, just for a vial of insulin, around about $300 per go. If you look at Nova Rapid in this country, I've been over in France following the death of my adopted dad, really. The cost, obviously you can claim it back under EU regs, the old E111 EHIC now. The cost for 5 vials of Rapid was about €80. Now, when you're looking at, maybe going through, 2 packs of that, 160 in a month, well, compare that to, the United States, where you'd be looking at least $600, and then compare that to, their average wages, and then compare that to our system. I just wouldn't gamble on the NHS being able to provide, especially in itself after sort of no deal, being able to provide, the basics. It would become unbelievably costly. And yes, I could see the government saying, well, these lovely American insurance firms, this isn't, it's not scaremongering. Just look at the NHS now. Richard Branson's profiting quite nicely from your misery, your illness, your ill health, and the sadness that are faced by, poor health, or in fact the social conditions that people find themselves in 2019.
And that's because we've done NHS sort of interviews before. It's difficult to get your head around it, but that's because parts of the services have been sold off to private companies who run it more for a profit. So that you've got, for example, they won't prioritise certain operations, or they actually, there's been examples of saying if people are smoking or are overweight, that they won't do certain operations already. So that's what we mean. It's still free at the point of use, but it's been reduced. The actual service you get has been reduced in these sorts of ways.
Well, the NHS was designed so that there would be universal healthcare, and that applied as much to dentistry as it did to opticians and all of that. And we can have something like that again. Just if people really take a good hard look. In a strange way, this election is probably one of, or could, is it the last free election we'll have? I don't know, but they've managed to convince people that the people who opposed the establishment of the NHS can be trusted with it. We heard John Major, a former Tory MP and Prime Minister, saying just today that if no one should trust Johnson with the NHS. It's staggering, but people believe that you've got someone who has been defending minorities and defending people's rights all of his life, who's described as a terrorist. Meanwhile, you have someone who has spent all of their life believing that they have a God-given right to rule, and someone who I mean, seriously, look at Johnson when he was the Foreign Secretary. Look at when he, him as Prime Minister. This man is very dangerous. This bumbling fool act is an act. He knows what he's doing. I just wanted to mute as well some of the issues for workers, as well as for the NHS and basically anything that's left that the public own. And I just thought I'd mention 6 key areas, really, in which I believe that with Johnson's deal or with us crashing out, that the government will immediately move to weaken. So I think...
Yeah, that's a good one to cover, actually. What are the workers' rights that we could lose? One thing that comes to mind is the 48-hour maximum working week. I mean, so, and then there's things about, your rights in terms of, just being fired. You've got... The Conservatives actually changed that so that you've got... you haven't got that protection to not be automatically sort of just fired from 1 year to 2 year, didn't they?
Yeah, they did that. What's called the enterprise, and that was another Liberal Democrat thing. So it's not just the Tories. It was called it was Vince Cable. I run a risk because I do a good impression of him. But it was called the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act in 2013. And yes, what it did is put people in what's known as the precariat. You're in precarious work. When it was a week ago, I was dealing with the redundancy situation for a friend and a member who, was just under the 2-year limit. So the employer believed that they could get away with all sorts, and of course, reminded them that they couldn't. But yeah, there'll be another attack there. It's funny you mentioned the working time regulations. That's number 1 on my list. I can see an absolute scrapping of the 48-hour. Let's just bear in mind that for some industries, from haulage, doctors, there are there aren't restrictions. Because, of course, Blair, I thought it was a great idea to have doctors who were doing 80, 90-hour days. Yes, I can see that evaporating immediately. I can see agency worker regulations. I'm not going into Swedish derogation or anything, but essentially, I can see that there'd be an expansion of 0-hour contracts and the removal of some of the sort of day one rights for agency workers. I can see that collective redundancies, there'll be reduced periods of consultation, removed, if not removed, reduced compensation in what's known as the protective award from 90 days. I can see cheapy, further relaxation over. Cheapy is complex, but I can see that being further weakened down in terms of things like protective periods. Maternity rights, 18 weeks of unpaid parental leave is an EU right. Personally, I think it should be paid. But I can see that they would go to prevent that right. I can see discrimination claims, so Disability Discrimination Equality Act discriminations, direct and all the rest of it, which isn't capped at the moment. I can see there being a statutory cap on compensatory awards, and that's just immediately. I wouldn't like to think about the bonfire that they're erecting, and then if you think that that's too extreme, let me just quote Dominic Raab here, who said, after Brexit, the UK should allow employers to force employees to work for more than 48 hours a week, abolish the minimum wage for all under 21-year-olds, abolish the right to time off for training, holidays, and trade union duties. allow employers to opt out of pension contributions for their employees, and allow employers to fire workers without recourse to tribunal.
So it's hiring and firing, basically. It's, you know, if things are all right and you get on with the boss and he likes you, it's you know, you just about manage to survive. But if you try to form a union, if you try, you know, that you've got just no right at all, really. You just, you know, you're in work 1 minute and then not the next, or
Yeah.
And 0 hours, of course, is you don't really know what your income will be. You can't base anything around it.
No, which, you know, will force a subservient. I mean, that really is going back to the Victorian or the American days, I should say. The United States, by and large, in a number of states, as it is today. Not all, of course. California seems to have a little bit more sense than its other sister states, but yeah, when you look at the Tories, I mean, I'm just quoting there from Dominic Raab. So, you know, Theresa May's former Brexit secretary. The writing's on the wall. That's what this election's about. It's not about Brexit. It's about, really, who do you trust with your employment rights? Who do you trust with the NHS, with welfare protection? You know, and the choice is there for you. If you really trust, if you believe the Brexit Party, who at the moment has nothing to say on those issues, fine. If you believe the Tories, who, well, I've just read out what they want to do. That's from them, not from me. If you like a bit of that, and fine. That's up to you. And if you really want to lend your vote to the Liberals who enabled, you know, the Enterprise Act and the reduction of rights, and, you know, were increasing tuition fees, you know, fine, by all means, you know, knock yourself out. And if you do so, you'll reconfirm a long-held view of mine that the British electorate are obviously sadomasochistic. Suffering must be what they enjoy.
Or just being really just trusting the establishment and not really questioning. I think a lot of it might come from just not questioning many things. And that's the actual details are not what come into it. That's just general perceptions of a party. For example, someone with a typical conservative view says it's the party which gets people into work, and of course, you know, the usual rhetoric would be against benefit claimants. So, you know, so people just go with an ideology rather than the absolute details of it.
Given Johnson's remarks on business, which I would love to repeat, but you know, include some pretty strong swear words. You know, the F word. Remember him saying F business and all of that. It's incredible, really, that people think he's running the party of business.
So even though they're seen as propping up corporations and being on the side of business rather than the worker, just, you know, so that.
But they're also the party that's incorporated, and just another point really on the US influence. It was the Conservative Party that put together a lot of the provisions for TTIP. If you recall, TTIP was rejected ultimately by the EU.
The transatlantic, yes, something to do with the transatlantic trade deal.
Yes, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, to give it its full title. Well, let's just consider also that this forms the basic nucleus for our future trade deals. Now, the idea that corporations can sue the government, you know, and if you know, I'm not here to educate, I'm just here to provoke you into thought. Have a look up the provisions of TTIP. Then have a look at why it is we're discussing chlorinated chicken and other such things. It's all to do with you know, it really is all to do with US standards and where we're slipping to.
Yes, in other words, being more lax than even the UK standards and obviously EU standards on things like that. So we might even end up having that if the standards do drop after a no deal. So, do you think just before we go into the Good Friday Agreement, to make that the last sort of thing, could you see? I know obviously you're not really on this side at all. There being any benefit at all to the Leave Brexit sort of side, and because obviously there is a left-wing side, a Lexit, that is opposed to perhaps the corporatist nature of the European Union, or they'll raise concerns such as it's not particularly democratic in the way it's set up, or that sort of thing. There's a so-called left-wing side. There's also a fairly considerable number of Labour Party supporters who are Leave. I'm not sure what the percentage would be. It might be about 25%, but I've just thrown a figure there. It's perhaps a little bit less than the Conservative side, because obviously there's a Remain side there as well. Can you see anything? Can you see into their point of view and see that there's anything appealing about it?
Well, of course. I mean, let me make it very clear: the European Union is not democratic. 1/3 of its institutions are. Whilst I supported Remain, I'm also a realist when it comes to it. Yeah, the EU's books have never been audited. There's restrictions on countries' abilities to nationalise industry. You have unelected technocrats, bureaucrats, and worse, doing everything from taking over the governments of Italy and Greece, going against democratic mandates, imposing austerity. Of course, the EU is not a democratic Valhalla, some socialist paradise. It isn't. And to those who voted to Remain, if you think so at your own peril. For Leavers, the idea that leaving is going to be some utopia where we control our own destiny is equally as problematic. Times have moved on from the days in which we used to own other people's countries, and I think Britain could have withstood leaving, crashing out, even if we had a manufacturing base. We don't. So the only thing I can suggest is, in the next 10, 20 years, it might be, with a decent government, that industry, I would assume green industry, can prosper, and that can later to more work. But,
I'm going to presume that Jeremy Corbyn's, he said he was 7-10 for Brexit actually originally, when he was drawn on it. It would have to be maybe the restrictions on nationalising things. It might have been one of the things that didn't appeal to him about the EU.
I completely agree. My view on it, though, is to rally the other countries to remove the state aid rules and enable countries to do what the bloody hell they want, frankly. So I can see that by voting to leave, or you wanting to do this from a socialist perspective, yeah, of course, the option to renationalise and all of that. Unfortunately, all things considered, when I saw who dominated that argument, that was not Nigel Farage and Johnson's lot. I don't recall them ever mentioning the term renationalisation. But of course, I can see why. I can certainly see why people voted to leave. We could all do with a bit of reality thrown in. Yeah, both sides were lied to, for sure. It's now it really is a case of I don't want, and I don't know anyone who just wants the status quo, let alone the band for that matter. I don't know anyone who wants just to be in the Remain camp. I know people who like freedom of movement and like the freedom to trade or do whatever in the trade union movement. The experience of Thatcher, by and large, changed a lot of our views because our protections, by and large, we've just mentioned GP redundancy, pregnancy, are underpinned now by EU directives, whether not by UK legislation. With all of that in mind, there is no reason why we couldn't go above EU legislation within, just as outside. But like I say, the EU desperately needs reform if it's going to survive. It needs to become democratic. If we are to have a future outside of it, then really Britain, it used to be respected world round even 5 years ago, needs to just remember that the EU is an institution. European countries should not be subject to the type of nonsense that's come out of our leaders' mouths around Germany, for example. One is saying, we've got this World War II spirit and we'll beat the Germans and all of that. Well, I'm sorry, Nigel Farage or some of the other grinning idiots, I forget his name, name will come to me, from the Tory side.
Rees-Mogg?
No, he's one of these Brexiteers who keeps going on about he's in the army and all of that. But Mark Francois, talking about this sort of German spirit of, defeating the Germans. I'm sorry, but no one around today in politics fought in the Second World War. And in fact, most people who did that I've spoken to are pretty appalled by the way in which we're treating our European friends.
Yes, a 100-year-old veteran was in tears about Brexit, actually. So it's not as if everyone was sort of gung-ho for just the British isolationists versus the rest of the continent. It's seen as a peace movement. It's not seen as a. But if you do speak to some Leavers who are on Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson's side, they actually compared it to the domination of Nazi Germany by actually saying, they say things such as we are dominated by Europe, so we fought for the freedom in the World War II, and one quote was, they make all our laws. So we got that sort of misconception. They make all our laws. Well, of course.
Well, they don't.
They don't. Well, no, that's as simple as that. Otherwise, might as well have packed up Parliament in 1976 or whatever year it was. Obviously, we didn't make any laws anymore. But I know.
Yeah.
How do you clear up that? How do you clear up that misconception? No. I should just end that one. Yeah. How do you clear up that misconception about what laws, and I know this is a bit complicated, but what laws they make in relation to, we know that we take part, there are standards and such like, but it's hard for people to separate EU legislation from UK parliamentary legislation. But how do you challenge that, say, on the doorstep?
Very simple. What's the point in electing? What's the point in having a general election if other people vote our laws? If you think that the EU, do people think the EU is responsible for cuts and austerity?
Well, of course, there are many things. I mean, I was asking the question, what protections would the EU have for people on benefits? I couldn't actually think of any examples really where it intervened with that.
It tends not to. It's more, like I say, it's more political and economic institution. One thing it does for people on benefits is give like for like. So whilst we might not see it here in Britain, if you've got any relatives who live in Spain or elsewhere in Europe, they'll be enjoying, well, for a limited time period, of course, healthcare, pension arrangements, and all of the rest of it. So, you know, and again, a like for like in terms of welfare entitlement. So, yes, I suppose we wouldn't see that. But if there's, you know, if anyone has any family who've emigrated, yeah, that's another problem with language, isn't it? When we talk about people who, you know, they're expats, you know, they're not. They're immigrants to another country.
I suppose it makes it sound more glamorous, really. It's like, well, I'm British and I'm expanding myself out to another country. And I live here now, but I'm not just an immigrant that's sort of just come in and we have to be sort of humble and it's a sort of lower status and beg for acceptance sort of feeling, isn't it? You know, they don't apply that to emigration, you know.
Well, I mean, coming back to your point, really, when we're looking at you know, some of the comments, you know, on the doorstep, so to speak, you get things like, "Oh, we want control of our borders." Well, there's 2 points I make to that. One, if you've been away and come back, you don't just walk through.
No, there's no Schengen agreement. So, for example, you can drive between France and Germany and Belgium in the car, and there's no. It's like going, as I would go through Queen's Ferry over to Anglesey in Wales. There's no border, but there is a border control going into the UK airports and Dover. You know, so we're not in the Schengen zone.
Yeah, indeed. My second point is the refugee camp at Sangatte, which was burned and moved on, but still there is a substantial camp. It appears that they can't get into the UK because something's stopping them. I wonder what that is.
Yes.
Other than the channel.
It's just an invisible force of some sort, isn't it? You know, it's not actually it's got nothing to do with passports and borders. It's just yeah. But yes, but of course there is free movement of people within the European Union. So you could be a German who wants to come and set up and do something in the UK, and you could want to work in Germany. You could meet somebody from France who becomes your wife. You know, and it's a lot easier to transition between at the moment, isn't it? Those things you've got the freedom to live, work, and travel, but it will change.
Well, it is, yes, but most of our immigration doesn't come from Europe. It comes from outside of the EU. And by and large, people who move from the EU into the UK either don't want to do the jobs that the Brits, will do the jobs that the Brits don't want to, or are skilled.
Yes, we could be having possibly therefore a skills shortage, because I think Priti Patel said she wanted to have an income threshold of what was it, about £36,000 a year, which means that perhaps some of if you're a trainee nurse, for example, it's not just low skilled jobs, but if you're coming to be a trainee nurse or something like that, you'd be put off because you wouldn't be able to meet that threshold coming from another EU nation. So that could be fundamentally very big changes to, you know, where we get skilled people from.
Yeah, I agree. And this idea of suddenly, you know, recruiting 6,000 doctors, a very good friend of mine, every year I've known him, really, or it feels like this, which is at least 12 years, he's been training and specialising as a doctor. The notion that you just apply and you're a doctor all of a sudden is ludicrous.
Well, it takes many years of training, but we've had a situation where many people have chosen to come and settle in Britain from EU countries and actually take up these positions and study to be a doctor and to work in the NHS, and it seems that, you know, that seems to almost outweigh the people we can get just from within the UK to do it for some reason. So it seems that we might even have possibly have a skills shortage if we can't get these people to want to come from the EU as we have been doing.
Well, again, we don't have to have a skills shortage. We could actually invest in our own services, but we haven't. Yeah, all we've been doing is gutting. Another way of looking at it, when the banks collapsed and we printed and lent them, over £1.5 trillion, of which they've paid nothing back.
Quantitative easing, but I suppose they will nationalise in some cases. It was New Labour, but they nationalised a bank there, didn't they? Or more than one.
Well, yes, they did, and we still own one, RBS, which allowed Thomas Cook to go under.
Yes, and then they were asking for help from the government, and it wasn't forthcoming. They did nothing to bail out Thomas Cook.
Well, indeed, if we have money to bail out banks, why do we not have money to bail out profitable companies like Thomas Cook?
So we're going to go to the Good Friday Agreement now, because obviously that's just literally a logistical problem in a way, isn't it? Which is that you once Britain is out of the EU, you've got Ireland in it, and you can just drive from Belfast to Dublin. You can, it's pretty much integrated, and there's no hard border. Do you see them bringing back a hard border?
Yes.
Because they've got to, instead of, say, a customs division down the Irish Sea, which is the sort of thing they've been talking about, or just some ways around it that are a little bit awkward like that, where they don't put a hard border in, but they still have to have, more of a border with Northern Ireland and Ireland in different ways.
The issue with this talk of borders and what have you, I mean, really we should just move a little away from it, because the primary issue is not the border, but it's the potential of further, bringing sectarian division.
So if we're afraid of terrorism so much, and I'm throwing that at Jeremy Corbyn in terms of the IRA and association, well, this could bring us right back into that territory if we mess around with Ireland.
Well, you've got, yes. I mean, I have very strong views on this. I mean, I'll declare them. Why it is that a country should continue to occupy another is beyond me. But really, one of the benefits of the EEC, ECEU, as we've had in terms of free movement, at least from sort of 92, Maastricht, etc., has been the fact that if you were a nationalist, you could claim that Ireland was unified, or at least nearly. There was free movement of people. There was elections to a supranational body. There was trade in sort of all but name, if that makes sense. You could also argue as a unionist.
It's almost partially integrated completely, really, in a way, even to the extent that RTE broadcasts within Northern Ireland, which is from Dublin. So it's almost like the compromise is, let's have a bit of both. Let's have the UK and Ireland, but that's not going to be so easy to do after a no deal, particularly.
Well, and this is the utter sham in which the Tories. So the current government, Theresa May's, was just as guilty. The contempt that they show, not just for the people of Northern Ireland on both sides, but actually for Britain. We don't want to go back to the Troubles. We talk about embarrassment. Britain, Mo Mowlam, the US, the Republicans in Ireland, the government of Ireland, unionists, all put down arms for peace, and calling people terrorists, and all of the rest of it doesn't help matters. At the end of the day, we have, by and large, albeit bubbling under, a note that the NRA have been flogging weaponry again to Northern Ireland, but in preparation, it seems. There's a very uneasy feeling there from what I understand. But the way the government is just held Northern Ireland with contempt, firstly, in only engaging with the DUP, there are other parties in Northern Ireland. Secondly, in the cavalier attitude of, well, we'll just have a customs territory just away from Northern Ireland. Well, in Scotland, who voted to remain just as, I think, 62% to Northern Ireland's 59%, why on earth are they not included in the special customs territory? You see, this is part of the fallacy, the lie in which we find ourselves in. Yes, I can see there would have to be some form of border. There would have to be some sort of restriction. That's really, that's the rules. I can see there being additional pressure. And I think Sinn Féin are hoping the Tories do well, because it furthers the argument that actually people will be wanting a united Ireland, and in a very strange way, you've got a situation where the DUP are actually supporting Corbyn for the opposite reason. It's a very unusual set of circumstances and times that we find ourselves, but be under no illusion. The instant there is a separation between the North and the South of any kind, there's going to be friction.
And what? So that friction could even really it could become an IRA bombing campaign in theory.
Yes, it could very well be. No one wants that, but there is an historic issue with Northern Ireland, with Ireland and England and Britain's relationship with it. At the end of the day, I can see that unless this is resolved in a way that prevents a border between the UK and the Republic of Ireland in this way, whether it's a customs union option would work, but it would mean that we would need freedom of movement.
I wonder how would Jeremy Corbyn do it differently? I wonder, because
I'll answer that directly. A customs union where we are out of the EU, so we are out of. We can exempt a sort of Norway model. This is we can exempt particular sections of our economy from EU rules. We could look at health, or we could put some arguments there, meaning that we could renationalise. We would have to pay in. We would have to accept free movement of people potentially. I mean, that would require a huge shift from the EU. If we want a customs union, we have to accept the four principles, freedoms, which are of freedom of movement, goods, services, and people. But where there's a will, there's a way with it. If we don't, two things are inevitable. Within our lifetimes, Ireland will be unified. And I can see that for a lot of people being a very joyous moment, and myself included, and Scotland's independent. I could see that within a 5 to 20 year timescale.
What's interesting is Jeremy Corbyn doesn't seem interested. I mean, I did watch his interview on the Andrew Marr show last Sunday, and he didn't seem at all interested in working with the SNP, which, or obviously what their end goal is, which is another second Indy ref, get another chance of being independent, which they would benefit mostly from the more right-wing governments getting in, because then they could claim that more people wanted to remain, and therefore, Scotland isn't represented by Westminster. But a Corbyn government would actually not do that for them.
Sorry to cut over, but did Andrew Marr really want Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, to start agreeing with the SNP?
So you're saying that he might have actually framed that rather than, rather than.
I'm sure Joe Swinson doesn't want to go out and say, "I can't wait to crawl back into bed with the Tories," but it's not odd for a political party to say no to something, and then ultimately end up having to climb down. by the end of the day, the Labour Party, as am I for that matter, generally is against any form of nationalism, however it presents itself. You know, for the reasons of history, really, as well as the problems. I mean, I completely agree that we work better as a country. But then again, I also respect if people want to leave a place, then that's entirely up to them. But I wouldn't support any nationalism. I don't think the Labour Party would either. It was still a one country party. But then again, why would Jeremy Corbyn say, "Oh yes, well we want Scotland to be independent" when we're fielding candidates in Scotland? I suppose. I wonder if Andrew Marr would ask Boris Johnson the same question, or does he just think that those two wouldn't work together or something?
Well, what's interesting about it is that if Scotland were to gain independence, it would actually be pro-EU. So it's actually, and of course, they would be freed from the right-wing Westminster government. And what's interesting about when you look at the party political policies of the Labour Party and the SNP, there's an awful lot of commonality there. For example, opposition to the bedroom tax and much of the austerity cuts. And obviously the Labour Party trying to get a majority. Imagine what would happen if they were allied with the SNP. How many, they might actually be able to get this majority. So the inability of either the Liberal Democrats to work with the Labour Party or the Labour Party to work with the SNP just seems to split up, obviously, particularly the Remain vote, what they might be hoping for. So what's interesting about it, the Scottish nationalism actually would be, under the SNP, would actually become an independent nation that would be enthusiastic about the EU. So it's a kind of paradoxical opposites there.
I think that, one of the things that we shouldn't do, just as we wrap up, is really phrase this. I mean, one of the things that Britain is famous for around the world is its class system. And I see what we've done with Brexit is turn this into, working class, upper class, and all the rest of it. But actually, we've turned it into a class issue. We've created a new caste, really, haven't we? Brexiteers versus Remainers.
Yes, which is often seen as a more right wing versus left, even though there are, of course, Lexiters and there are some more right wing pro Remainers. But ultimately, it's come down those lines. As a majority, a left versus right.
We haven't people. People don't refer to. The last referendum on the EU of Remainers versus Labours, and I'm on about the one in the 70s.
Oh, yes, and that was a yes, obviously.
It's a yes. We don't refer to each other in those terms. And I think that, we run the risk. The way that the Labour Party wins this election isn't by engaging with it being a Leave or Remain election, or whether you'll Leave or Remain.
Yeah, and that's what we're coming to, isn't it? How can we get this separate at the election when there's other issues as well? And that's what you're coming to now again, full circle.
Talk about other issues.
Yes. So the future of the NHS in the case, or welfare benefits, and the number of police on the streets, all the things about the infrastructure of the UK, which you can't so easily talk about when you're just talking about where each political party stands on Remain or Leave.
Well, indeed, and Brexit has nothing to do with the number of hospital beds or anything else like that. The economic arguments do, but we haven't left yet. This election's got to be about everything other than Brexit, frankly.
But of course, the establishment, as we said at the beginning there, is that they're interested in only making it about Brexit, and therefore that'll stop the spotlight in this election compared to even that of 2017 being on those issues. That's the thing. So we don't even have to put a spotlight under Conservative policies on this, that, and the other.
Well, I think that if we engage with that, and we engage with the fact that this is just a Brexit election, what's the point in another referendum?
So that's it. So that's why we've got to make it about something else. And of course, what's interesting is that the Labour Party is offering another referendum. So that's exactly what you're voting for if you're voting for the Labour Party, because that is a choice between, it will be labelled a soft Brexit, or a deal Brexit, but or just remain. So you know those are the two things you can vote for. But and another thing his opponents say about it, though, is that he will be, or the Labour Party will be negotiating against itself, therefore trying to frame them as if they're still a Remain party. But of course, Jeremy Corbyn has said he's 7-10 for Brexit, so surely they wouldn't be campaigning against their own thing in this. If they're just offering a choice.
Well, indeed, and I can think of nothing worse than another referendum. It'll divide the country, but unfortunately, I can't see another way out of this. So
obviously, I suppose if it did end as a soft Brexit, it might be more doable because a deal would be allowed, and at the moment it's so difficult because it's as you outlined before, how difficult it really is to actually do no deal because of how long it takes to renegotiate trade agreements that take 10 years, that sort of thing. And whereas it at least wouldn't be that were having to be done quite the same, and remain simple. You just don't do anything more about it and stay in. That's it. There's nothing to do, is there, as such, then? You just say, that's it, we're not doing anything. I suppose then there could be, maybe there'd be some sort of uprising from the right who said that their first referendum result wasn't honoured. I don't know how the country would deal with that sort of an uprising, whether there'd be unrest.
Given what's happened to trade union rights, workers' rights, people's rights, the prevalence of the security state since 2001, illegal invasions into other countries, the real potential of losing human rights, the fact that there were gerrymandered seats, a reduction in the number of seats in the Commons, the fact that we've allowed a situation where millions of people are on the streets without any houses, the fact that there are food banks where 5 million people rely upon them every day. We have people who are dying because they can't refrigerate their insulin, and the people haven't risen up already. I wonder why it is they would do the same.
Just because they were on the Brexit side. Because in other words, I presume that there might be the sort of far right groups, such as the ones that we've seen, like the English Defence League and Combat 18, all these different ones. Maybe they would be the ones who would be causing trouble. Those sorts of organisations.
If they decided to cause trouble, Michael, I would be the first to go and hire a Mr. Whippy ice cream van that sold milkshakes, and that should be the defence against them.
Well, it sounds like we're making a Harry Enfield sketch now, because we can say those. So, in other words, the Brexiteers wouldn't be something to worry if Well, that's the problem, isn't it, with dividing the country? Is you've got one side who'll presumably be very unhappy with whatever happens. It's very hard to make a compromise, but
you already have one side that are unhappy.
Yes, and that's the thing.
And they haven't hit the streets either.
No, protest. Well, we are renowned as a nation, really, that often it is said, we have very little protest to anything that happens, even though there have been things. I mean, the Remain march in London did get about 1 million people onto the streets, and the opposition to the Gulf War in 2002 did as well. So we can get them onto the streets, but maybe not on the level of rioting.
Well, we can certainly get people onto the streets, but it's just always just under the number of people to actually affect change.
Yes. So I wonder what your final thoughts on this would be then.
My final thoughts were on the election.
Yes, I haven't really given much to. Obviously, you've given your thoughts on that, really, haven't you? So,
I think my final thoughts are that really, this election is about food on plates. It's like any election, really, and if you genuinely believe that you have a voice and you can affect some change, then it's not about, if you're told that this election is about Brexit, then I would be questioning why it is that you're being pushed down one particular route. There are sometimes you vote for a party or a candidate and you don't agree 100% with everything they have to say, but you vote for the party that closest demonstrates your views. And if your views are only about Brexit and you care not about services around you, people's rights and what have you, then that's your call. But I've never met anyone like that. I've never met people who don't have an opinion on something, other than just Brexit. I've met people who got wide beliefs, and whilst they might have voted one way or the other, like to express them. This is a general election, not a referendum.
Unfortunately, I have met people who are, it's almost a religious belief in something like Brexit, or, well, you might support the Conservative Party, but it doesn't matter about what evidence you give about things. They still just say, "Oh well, you're just not looking on the bright side. I'm sure it'll be okay." It's like a sort of faith almost, and that was what was said actually in a Remain meeting. That's why it's so hard to break that. To look at the other side, and you could even say the same for. You might even, in some ways, you might be able to say the same for the Labour Party and Corbyn, and some supports of ideologies are often almost like supporting the rules of a religion, and it can't just be contradicted by things that would appear to turn that upside down. They just find something else to support the ideology instead.
Well, I think I think an ideal point to close would be, of course, you've mentioned faith and politics. So, of course, I think we'd have to remind ourselves of Voltaire. Voltaire, who said, if we ever want true equality, and he's writing this in the late 1600s, if we ever want true equality, then the last priest should be hung by the entrails of the last politician. I think that sums up where we are today, in fact.
Okay, well, I'll leave you with that thought. Thanks, J. Martin from Carlisle, and your thoughts on this election, which could be about everything other than Brexit as well, actually, if you wanted it to be. So